Erev Tov Rabotai, we are continuing with our Mishna Yomi, Masechet Challah. We're up to Perek Aleph Mishnah Vav. Today's Mishnayot should be L'Nishmat Neria ben Svedlana Aranbayev and Eliyahu ben Burcha Israelov Menuchatam Meganedin. Amen. Having taught that dough cooked in water is exempt from Challah, the Mishnah today will deal with cases in which dough was first cooked and then baked. HaMe'isa, regarding a Me'isa, which is a bread made by pouring flour into hot water and then baking the mixture. Bet Shammai Potrin, Bet Shammai exempted from Challah because such bread is considered cooked, not baked, and cooked bread is exempt from Challah. The Mefarshim explain when flour is mixed in hot water, it becomes cooked. So Bet Shammai hold that bread made from cooked dough is not considered bread, therefore it is not subject to Challah. Now in the previous Mishnah we learned that once flour and water were made into a dough, this dough is subject to Challah even if it is later cooked. Here, however, the cooking took place before the dough was finished, therefore it is not considered bread. Bet Hillel mehayvin, but Bet Hillel obligated in Challah. Bet Hillel hold that since Me'isa is baked at the end, it is considered a baked item which is subject to Challah, because Bet Hillel hold that bread made from cooked dough is considered bread, therefore it is obligated in Challah. The Mishnah now discusses the halakha of another type of bread that is first cooked and then baked, a chalita. Regarding a chalita, a bread made by pouring hot water onto flour and then baking it. Bet Shammai mehayvin, Bet Shammai obligated in Challah because it is baked at the end and it is therefore considered a baked item. Bet Hillel potrin, but Bet Hillel exempted because it was originally cooked, therefore it is not considered cooked. Therefore it is considered cooked bread, which is exempt from Challah. And the Mefarshim explain, Me'isa and Halita are essentially the same. Both are made by mixing flour with hot water and then baking it. The only difference is that Me'isa is made by pouring the flour into the hot water, while Halita is made by pouring the hot water onto the flour. Therefore, the same halakha should apply to both. But Bet Shammai exempt Me'isa from the Challah obligation, but obligate Halita. And on the other hand, Bet Hillel obligate Me'isa, but exempt Halita. And the Gemara Masechet Pesachim, page 37b, explains this is actually not the case. In actuality, these two machlokot, these two disputes, are two different versions of the machloket between Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel. According to the first version, Bet Shammai exempt Me'isa from Challah because it was cooked first, while Bet Hillel obligated. However, Me'isa is mentioned only as an example. The same applies to Chalita as well, what we call Huwa din Chalita. The second version of the Machloket discusses Chalita and has the opinions reversed. Bet Shammai obligated in Challah, even though it was cooked, while Bet Hillel exempted since it was previously cooked. Here too the Machloket is with regards to both Chalita and Me'isa, the Huwa din. And that is how the Rav explains the Mishnah, and the Rav concludes, Ulinyan psak halakha, regarding the halakha, ben Me'isa, ben Halita, whether Me'isa or Chalita, im nefet betanur, if it's baked in an oven, hayvot b'chala, vim b'machreshet or b'machvat, b'chol davar sha'or overet tachta, p'tura min hachala. But if it's through any other means, like a fire in a pan, and anything where the fire is under it, that would be exempt from Challah. The Mishnah now begins a new discussion. A person who is saved from a dangerous situation brings an animal as a todah offering when a nazir, which is someone who accepts a certain type of vow that forbids him in wine, grapes, and various other things, when he completes his term of nizirut, he brings certain animal offerings. The Torah requires someone bringing either a todah or a nazir offering to bring various types of breads along with the animal offering. These breads come into two basic categories, the loaves and wafers. The Torah speaks about it in Sefer Vayikra, chapter 7, pasuk 12 and 13, and Sefer Bamidbar, chapter 6, pasuk 13. The Mishnah now discusses the Challah obligation of these breads. Halot, Todah, Urkike, Nazir, regarding the loaves of a Todah offering and the wafers of the Nazir offering. The halakha is as follows, and the Mefarshim explain, the Torah actually requires both the person bringing a Todah offering and the person bringing the Nazir offering to bring both loaves and wafers. Now, the Mefarshim deal with why the Mishnah mentioned only the loaves of Todah and wafers of Nazir offering. That's dealt in the commentaries. But the Mishnah says, what's the halakha regarding the loaves of a Todah offering and the wafers of the Nazir offering? Asan that's patur. If one made them for himself, meaning he prepared the breads for his own Todah or Nazir offering, he is exempt from separating Challah because the bread is considered bread of Hekdesh, which is exempt from Challah. And the Mefarshim explain, the Torah describes Challah as the first of your doughs, Rashit Arisotechem, in Bamidbar chapter 15, pasuk 20. Now, the term your dough, the Rav says, implies that only privately owned dough is obligated in challah, not dough of hekdesh. Now, even though the owner did not actually consecrate the dough, it is still exempt. Since the owner intended at the time of the kneading to use the dough for his offering, it is exempt as if it were already hekdesh. However, limkor bashuk chayav, if he made them to sell in the marketplace to people who need them for their todar and nazir offerings, he is obligated to separate halah, because since the seller knows that he might not find any buyers for his bread, he realizes that he may end up keeping the breads for his own use rather than bringing them up as a kulban. Therefore, the breads are not considered hekdesh and are subject to halah. That is in Rabotai of Mishnah Vav. Mishnah Zayin now deals with cases in which one needed an amount of dough that is obligated in challah, but he had in mind to divide the dough into portions that will not have a challah obligation. Nachtom she'asa se'or lehalek. If a baker made a sourdough that was large enough to have a challah obligation, it was made, Mefoshim say, from at least 1 1/4 kav of flour, like we said in Mishnah Daled. Now, sourdough is made by leaving dough to ferment. It is added to regular dough in order to help it rise. So if a baker made sourdough that was large enough to have a challah obligation, but he had in mind to divide the dough into portions less than the minimum challah amount, which is each of the portions was less than 1 1/4 kav, and to sell those portions to his customers, chayav b'challah. The law is that he is obligated in challah because the baker knows that he might not be able to sell the sourdough and has in mind that if it happens, he will bake the dough as one big bread. Now, since he may bake the amount that is subject to challah, he must separate challah, and Mefashim explain, after kneading the dough, before letting it ferment into sourdough, the baker checks to see if he has enough customers interested in buying sourdough. If he cannot find customers, he doesn't make it into sourdough, but he bakes it as bread. Once he makes it into bread, it is always possible that he will make it into one large bread. Therefore, when the baker makes the dough originally, he knows that he might not end up dividing the dough, and therefore he would be subject to challah. The Mefarshim explain, if at the time of kneading one has definite plans to divide the dough, it is exempt from challah, as we will learn in the next case of the Mishnah. But the Mishnah is teaching that in the case the baker knows that he might not divide it, it is therefore obligated in challah. Now, while the Mishnah discusses sourdough, its ruling certainly applies where the baker intended to sell the portions as regular bread, because in any case he's making bread, he is certainly open to the possibility of making one large bread, even if he prefers making smaller loaves. Now, the Mishnah teaches that even in a case where the baker planned on making sourdough and did not plan on using the dough for bread at all, he still has in mind that he might make it into one big bread and therefore would be obligated in challah. The Mishnah continues, Nashim shenatnu lenachtom la'asul lahen se'or. But in the case of women who each gave a portion of flour to a baker to make sourdough for them, and the baker made one big dough out of all the flour, large enough to be subject to challah, because instead of kneading each portion individually, the baker kneaded all the flour together as one big dough, and all the flour together measured 1 1/4 kav. Im en bishel ahad men kashiur. The halacha is that if none of the women's portions was the amount that is obligated in challah, meaning none of the women gave a portion larger than 1 1/4 kav. Now, even if only one of the women gave the amount, the entire dough would be subject to the challah obligation, even the part that came from the other women, because since it's all combined into one dough and part of the dough is obligated in challah, the whole dough is subject to challah. But the Mishnah says if none of the women's portions was enough to be obligated in challah, peturah min challah, the dough is exempt from challah, because in this case the baker must divide the dough in order to return to each woman her portion. Unlike in the previous case in which the dough belongs to the baker, here the dough belongs to the women who gave him the flour. Therefore, he doesn't have the option of making the dough into one larger bread. And therefore, he is certain that he will divide the dough into pieces that are not obligated in challah, and therefore it is not subject to the obligation of challah, because again, since he plans on dividing the dough, it's considered as though it is already divided, and it does not have the minimum amount that is subject to the challah obligation. That is in Rabotai today's Mishna Yomi. Baruch Adonai Leolam. Amen v'amen.